Hi, my name is Rick Edgman. I'm your Management 602 Production and Operations Management Professor. Today we're going to talk a little bit about project management with some additional topics thrown in, project scoping, and also team charters. There will be a few useful tools that are also included in this presentation. So what is a project? A project is a sequence of unique, complex, and connected activities. They have one goal or purpose, and that the project must be completed by a specific time within budget and according to specifications, regardless of where those specifications come from, usually from the customer. What are some of the project management criteria? Projects are oriented toward a goal, something unique about every project. Projects have finite duration, and if you don't bound them by time, you're almost sure to have problems. We'll talk about that later in this presentation. And projects require coordination of interrelated activities. What is project management? It's a set of principles and tools that help us define, plan, execute, control, and complete a project. It's important because it helps you organize your approach, generate a credible schedule, that is one that's founded on facts. It helps you track progress and control your project. It helps you identify where to focus your efforts. It helps you identify problems early before they become crises. And it saves you time and money. And if you fail to plan, usually you're planning to fail, whether you know it or you don't. So there are typically about 5 phases in project management. First one is you need to be able to scope your project. And we're going to spend significant time on scoping inside this particular presentation. Then you need to develop a plan to execute the project. You launch that plan. You monitor and control as you go through the project. And you close out the project. In terms of scoping the project, also 5 main steps. State the problem or opportunity that you're hoping to conquer or leverage. Establish the unique project goal. Define the project objectives. Identify the success criteria. And list assumptions, risk, and obstacles. So on scope, here's what you're going to be asking yourself. And there's going to be several main things that you're going to want to be looking at. First, on what process or project or product or system or service do you really want to focus on as a team? Notice I said team because projects are almost always carried out by teams. What are the boundaries of the process that you're to improve? What's the starting point of that process? What's the ending point? What's in bounds? What's out of bounds? What things are totally off limits to you? So what resources are available to the team? Under what, if any, constraints must the team work? Time? Money? What might they be? What is the time commitment expected of team members? What are the advantages to each team member for the time commitment that they will dedicate to the project? You should always be able to identify a sort of what's in it for me element for the project that you're participating on. That is, you want to create a win-win opportunity as you're conducting a project. So there are about 8 steps for establishing team project boundaries. And we will take a look at those. So those 8 main steps are these. 1 through 4 on this slide, 5 through 8 on the following slide. Identify the customer. Who is it that receives the process output? Might be an internal customer, might be an external customer. Define customer expectations and needs. And we're usually wanting to be very careful about that. We might use several methods for doing that. But ask them, think like a customer. Rank or prioritize those expectations. Clearly specify the deliverables that are tied to those expectations. It's one thing to know what those expectations are. It is an altogether different thing to know how it is that you expect to be able to meet those expectations. So what are the process outputs? There should be some probably tangible deliverables. There might be some intangible ones, just sort of the way people feel about things. Rank or prioritize those deliverables. Not everything is equally important. It's the old saying that if everything is important, nothing is important. If everything is a priority, nothing is a priority. Rank your confidence in being able to make or meet each deliverable. Identify the CTQs for those deliverables. CTQ is an acronym that's often used in a field called Six Sigma, but it stands for critical to quality. So identify those things that are critical to the quality of the solution that you deliver to your customer. That is, CTQs come from the customer. What are the specific measurable attributes that are most critical in the deliverables? And select the ones that have the greatest impact on customer satisfaction. You may not be able to work on all of those, but you should be able to work on some of them, hopefully the most important ones. Map your process. Now, there are a lot of different types of process maps, and we have or will talk about some of those as we go through the course. But I always recommend that you map the process the way that it is today. But then always try and map out its ideal future form. Because oftentimes in having those two maps side by side, you'll be able to identify some so-called low-hanging fruit, easy ways of improving the circumstance, even if it's not the ideal solution right away, but some low-hanging fruit. So normally you're going to be able to tell how good of a job you did at the end of the project by taking a look at the difference between your current map and what you end up with at the end. How much of the gap between the current and the ideal will you have been able to close? Determine where in the process the CTQs can be most seriously affected. Those are the places where you have leverage. Now, whether it's affected for good or affected for bad, those are still leverage areas. So use a detailed flowchart, usually called a process map, of the process to be able to help you identify where those places are. And estimate which steps contain the most variability in what happens. Because if we can identify those steps with the most variability, that enables us to do something additional, which is that it enables us to focus on reducing the variability and producing more consistent output. So evaluate those ones which have the greatest opportunity for improvement. Consider the resources that you have available to you. Those resources may dictate that you can work on some things but not on others, even though some of the others are perhaps even more important. Compare variation in the processes with the various CTQs and emphasize the process steps which are under the control of the team conducting the project. And last, define the project to improve the CTQs that you've selected. Now, why do I say that? I say that because the likelihood is that you will identify several CTQs, but in most real circumstances, you can only work on one or a few of those several. And hopefully, they'll be the most important one or few that you're able to work on. If you were working on a project here, I would have an activity for you right now, which would be create a team charter for your product, your service, or business idea. But then you'd have to know what a team charter is, wouldn't you? So we're going to see what a team charter is within this particular presentation. But not quite yet. So you've seen that in the 5 phases of project management, that the first phase is scope the project. Second would be something like develop the plan. Third, launch the plan. Fourth, monitor and control. Fifth, close out the project. But what about developing the plan? Stage 2. Ordinarily, you might see things like this. Identify the project tasks that have to be completed. A tool that's useful for that is called a work breakdown structure. Estimate how long it takes to complete each task that's listed in that work breakdown structure. because then you can develop a realistic timeline for completion. Determine the resource requirements that you have, what's needed, what isn't. Construct and analyze the project network. We may not pay attention to that in here. And then prepare your project proposal. Oftentimes, that's included within the context of a team charter. So what is a work breakdown structure? It is a functional decomposition of a system. That means that it looks at the actionable items that have to be completed for you as you go through the project. So it breaks the project into chunks of work at a level of detail that meets the needs that your team has for planning and scheduling purposes. Here's an example, a simple one that most of you would be able to relate to. Is something as simple as going to the grocery store. Now, obviously, a lot of people don't do that in a highly efficient way. I'm one of those. If I go to the grocery store, I usually go in with an objective, which is to get one or two things that I need. But I often walk away with much more because I haven't really taken a look to see what I might need or what I'm short on or what I have a large supply of. So my level 1 task, if I were more serious about it, would be to prepare at home. Well, what does prepare at home mean? That's the rest of what you see above the black banner in the middle of the slide. It would be to check your refrigerator, check your pantry, see what you've got, see what you don't, identify what you need. If you're somebody like, say, my wife, who takes expiration dates of milk or cheese or other perishable food products seriously, then you would be checking the expiration date as she does. And then determine maybe in advance how it is that you're going to pay. Are you going to use a credit card? Do you have a member's card that's useful to help you maybe pick up gasoline points or something of that sort? Are you going to write a check? You're going to pay with cash? Be prepared. Next thing, go to the store. How are you going to get there? What's your route, etc.? Prepare at the store. How are you going to hold the groceries? You're going to use a cart, a basket? Isn't it just a few things, so you're going to hold it in your hands? How are you going to do that? And then how are you going to go through the grocery store? Are you going to wander around looking for what you need, or do you have, let's say, a planned route because you've been to that grocery store many times, or you studied in advance? I can tell you that on occasion we go to Salina, Kansas, because we want to go to the Lowe's, that is the building material center and so on, that is in Salina. But before we go, we always look to see for specific things what aisle or what bay those things are on. Now, we may see other things while we're there, but we do go prepared and we know exactly where to go in the store in advance to get those things that we want. And because you can check inventory online in advance, we know whether or not it's in stock. How do you check for completeness of your work breakdown structure? Well, ordinarily what you want is these should be measurable. You should be able to tell how much progress you're making on a particular task or if you've completed it. So that means there should be clearly defined start and end events for each task. And for that matter, for the entire project represented by the work breakdown structure. Each activity has a deliverable. It's a list. It's an item in your cart. It is, etc. Time and cost should be easily estimated. Well, that word easily may not be so applicable depending on the circumstances, but the point is that we should have viable, realistic means of estimating how much time and how much cost are associated with any given task and with the overall project. The activities, their duration are within acceptable limits so that we don't experience, let's say, time creep and overrun the amount of time that we have available to us to complete a project. And then work assignments are independent. That is, we can describe a given task and what needs to be done for that task. Every other task that is listed on the work breakdown structure can also be independently described. What are some of the ordinary resources you might use in projects so that you can plan appropriately? People. Who, what, how much authority do they have? How much experience do they have? What's their expertise level? Do they have the connections inside the organization that they need to be able to help carry out your particular project? What is it? So the people. So we're not saying use Smith. We're not saying use Gonzalez. We're saying we need this person who happens to be named Smith because of what Smith brings to the table to apply to the project. Same thing with Gonzalez or anybody else on the team. Facilities. What facilities are you going to be using? What are the particular advantages and disadvantages that they have? What are the shortcomings? Do we have everything we need in terms of facilities? How about the equipment? Is there any equipment that's needed? And if so, do we have access to it? Is it outdated? Does it need modified? Is it in good repair? Does it need to be, let's say, go through some maintenance before it can be used? What about the financial resources? Do we have the money that we need to carry out this project? Materials? Time? All of those are the sorts of resources that you consider when you're carrying out a project. Now, how do you estimate how long it takes to do something? If it's something that you're highly familiar with, you may be able to just say, oh, that takes about 10 minutes. But if it's not something that you're highly familiar with, then you might be able to estimate either from historical data, or you might happen to be able to call on the expertise of other people who are really familiar, or it may be something that's very similar to some other activity. Therefore, you would estimate the amount of time that it takes as being relatively similar. Duration is a cause of variation. If we estimate something to take 5 minutes, or let's say 5 days, but in reality it could be anywhere between 1 and 13 days, well, now that's really something. So I think I mentioned previously, not today, but previously, that my wife and I are doing a significant amount of remodeling to our home. One of the things that we wanted in the remodeling was 3 new doors, one of which was a front door, which is different from the other 2 in some ways. We were told, because of the pandemic, when we ordered on May 8th, that it would be essentially 8 weeks and we'd have everything. And that represented a delay because of the pandemic. Before the last door was in, it was the middle of December. 7 months compared to the original estimate of 8 weeks. So why did that happen? Well, it happened mostly because of the pandemic and how that impacted particular partners in the supply chain. But those particular partners, it was how long would it take for them to complete a task? And hence, how long would it take before they could deliver their part? Now, they estimated, probably based on significant historical data and experience with the process, they estimated one thing, but they never had done that in a pandemic before. And so the duration, as impacted by the pandemic, turned out to be a major factor in this. And it wasn't just the doors that led to some of the delays that we've had. So this is ongoing work for us. We're now more than 9 months into this project that we thought was going to be literally a few-month project. Okay, how about some of the main causes of variation? Different skill levels. So you can estimate how long it takes to do something for somebody with X amount of experience, but if you don't have that person with that experience level, then it may take longer, it may be done sooner. Unexpected things, the pandemic. The efficiency of work time. Some people work very efficiently. Some don't. Mistakes. Misunderstandings. When we look at a project, remember it's a series of activities. So we need to look at any linkages that exist between and among activities and tasks. Because those dependencies that are there, those linkages, those create the backbone of your project network. And we might represent those graphically as something like this. If you have two tasks A and B, the way that this is pictured, you see that you have to complete A before you can move to B. So formally, not that I'm concerned about the vocabulary, but formally we would call task A predecessor task. We would call B a successor task, meaning that A has to proceed or come before B. B cannot come until A is complete. Some of the tools that are very useful, one of the tools that's very useful, is the Gantt chart. And some of you have probably encountered Gantt charts before. We're not going to spend a lot of time on them, but it's a visual scheduling tool that you might post up on a wall, or you might be using software, but would allow you to keep track of everything that needs to be done, the order it needs to be done in, how long it's taking, whether you're ahead of or behind schedule, and so on. So it helps you track in real time how your project is coming. It is a graphical representation of the information that is in your work breakdown structure. And for that matter, assuming that you've constructed a work breakdown structure, that would represent, let's say, the rows in a Gantt chart. It shows dependencies and it tracks progress. So in a very simplistic sort of representation graphically, we'd have the activities, let's say those things listed in the work breakdown structure as the rows in your Gantt chart. And then we would have, if activity 1 is estimated to take 2 days, we would draw a bar that was 2 days long, whatever that was. A bar 2 days long. If you couldn't start activity 2, which takes 3 days all by itself, until you were half done with activity 1, then you might start activity 2 at the end of day 1 and stretching through day 4. Excuse me. And then you would be able to track. So it might look something like that. Any big milestone? Big milestone, something that you need to complete by such and such day. It is a major thing that you've been able to accomplish. So we usually represent those with diamonds. We know what the dependencies do. They show relationships between activities with arrows. Here would be a very simple example of a Gantt chart where you have business objectives. They're scheduled to be maybe started by May 10th. We need to secure our budget and resources by June 7th. These things across the top, those are the big milestones. And for people who take this seriously, you might see a little bit more explanation in this particular graphic. And then here's a more realistic example for you, even though it's a 20-some-odd-year example. Something else useful, if it's everybody's job, it's nobody's job. So that leads us to create something called a roles and responsibilities matrix. So here it just says responsibility matrix, but a roles and responsibilities matrix. So we will associate these with task or activities. And then the roles are being played by 3 people here, Kai, Jens, and Kristen. If you want to be generic, rather than use the names of the people, you would have whatever functions it is that they fulfill. So maybe Kai is the vice president for finance. So instead of saying Kai, you would say vice president for finance because that's what you need. It isn't that you need Kai per se. You only need Kai because Kai is the vice president for finance. And similar for Jens and Kristen. You would have whatever their actual roles are listed there. Now, in those places where you see the X's in this matrix, what that would tell you is that Jens is primarily responsible for activity 1. It's on him. Kristen is primarily responsible for activity 3. That's on her. Kai is primarily responsible for activity 2. That's on him. What I always recommend is always have a backup. So I would usually have at least one other person listed for each activity. At least one other person. I would always have somebody who was the most responsible. However, I know, we all know that sometimes things happen. Excuse me. People die, people retire, people get sick, families have children, families have elderly relatives, people are involved in accidents. All kinds of things can happen. Somebody accepts a new position and they leave in the middle of the project. That's why I always recommend that you have not only listed whoever is primarily responsible for a task, but assign secondary responsibility to someone else. And if it's a big enough team and an important enough project or task, then you assign a third person as well, as sort of the backup's backup. Look out for the creepers. Scope creep. So, I used to be at the University of Maryland. And at the University of Maryland, I ran a large and successful honors program. The students in that program were required to work in teams to complete large projects for companies. We charged the projects out at $5,000 per team. A really poor project would pay back about $100,000 on the $5,000. Probably the single best project coming out of that program while I was there was one that paid back an estimated $4 million. The money wasn't the main benefit related to that project. In fact, that project was related to national security in the wake of 2001, 9/11. So what they were looking for wasn't monetary at all. It just happened to have a monetary benefit attached to it. But across the various projects that I had students attached to in teams during the years that I was at the University of Maryland, each team had at least a senior vice president from whatever company, including many companies that you would know, GE, Black & Decker, Raytheon, and so on. FedEx. Each team had a liaison inside the company that gave them at least 1 hour a week of their time to work with them on making sure that their project was really delivering what it was supposed to deliver. Now, these were honor students at one of the best universities in the nation. They're almost by definition, they're overachievers. One of their strengths and one of their weaknesses at the same time is they don't know what they can't do. By which I mean they don't know what they're not capable of. They think they can do anything. And they were really good, and oftentimes they would way over-deliver early on in the course of that project that they were working on. And so what would happen is that senior vice president, or whoever their company liaison was, would say, well, if you can do that, how about can you do this also? Can you do this also? Can you do that also? Scope creep. The project would get bigger and bigger and bigger, and that usually comes from the customer. And even though I would see that happening to these teams, I would let it happen. And there's a reason that I let it happen in those teams until they became overwhelmed. Now, that didn't happen to every team by any means, but maybe a third. I would let it happen because it is important to learn to say no earlier rather than later. It's important to learn to say no when you're a student instead of promising something and then not being able to deliver once you're out there on the job. So scope creep. Hope creep. Oh, well, you'll check your status reports. You're falling behind. You can see that the project is lagging, but, it'll be okay. It'll be okay. I know it'll be okay. Hope creep. Effort creep. Effort creep is when you are working and working and working and working, and you're working hard. And you don't know why, but you're not making remotely the progress that's necessary. And then feature creep. Feature creep is a little bit different. Feature creep is when your customer wants X. And this a lot of times is associated with people, let's say, who are engineers, design engineers by training. It'll happen when they say, well, we can give them that. We can do that for them. Sure we can. But we can do this other thing for them also. And the designer becomes infatuated with their own ability to deliver. And so they keep adding on and adding on and adding on to what they deliver, sometimes to the joy of the customer and sometimes not. So what you're hoping for in virtually any project is something like this. If you were to split the time curve into 3 equal pieces, third the time, the middle third, the last third. In the first third, it's very typical in a good project. It's very typical that in that first third, you make 25% of the progress. That is 33% of the time, 25% of the progress. In the middle third, 33% of the time, you get 50% done of what needs to be done. And then the last third of the time, you make the last 25% of the progress. That's the fine tuning. This is the curve that you don't want. It's that white curve that you see on bottom. And that's one of those ones that you just are working, you're working hard, time is passing, you're not hitting your milestones, you're not delivering what you've promised to whoever the customer is, whether that customer is your boss or whether it's some external customer, but you're not delivering. So that after 70, 80% of the time, you've only got about a third of the work done. That's a problem. Okay, so that's a little bit on project management and on scoping the project. But let's take a little bit of a look about organizing the team. Because every team, every project should have a team charter. And that charter represents the business case for the project. It's more or less, what is it you're going to do? Why is this important? What are the consequences of doing the project and doing it well? That is, what's the benefit? What are the big priorities that are out there? And also, what happens if we don't do this project? What are we missing out on? How does it fit with the other things that we're doing inside the business? Okay. Then you see B, which says, yep, we want to provide a problem statement that describes the opportunities for improvement and a goal statement. We want both problem statements and goal statements to be so-called smart ones. So you've probably heard that acronym before. You may know it by heart by now. If not, you should. Whether you heard it in this course or some other. And if you don't know it by heart, you want to walk away from your bachelor's degree having learned it by heart. So SMART stands for specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time-bound. And then we'll talk about that a little bit, I believe, on the next slide. You want to be able to define the process. Where does it start? Where does it finish? Who's on the team? Why are they on the team? What do they bring? What are the expectations of those people, each person, and so on. You probably have a cover page. Cover page might look more or less like that. Fill in the relevant data. Specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, or realistic. Time-bound. So specific says we know what it is we need to get done. We can wrap our hands around it. We can talk about it. We have a common understanding. Measurable says we can measure that how much progress we're making and how quickly. Attainable means that you want to be able to accomplish this, and you can do it. Hopefully, you can't do it too easily. That is what we want, is we want our objectives to be stretch objectives. We want them to be able to make a real difference for us. Okay, not just something easily completed. So attainable, but not easily so. Relevant, it should make a difference. It should make a difference. And time-bound, because if you don't do that, almost certainly you're going to run over time. And you'll just have it creep. It'll become less and less a priority. It'll be set aside and other things will be prioritized, whatever the case may be. In a team charter, I usually recommend these 10 elements for every team, well, almost every team charter. The first 9 are ones that they use in GE. The 10th one is one that I add. Okay, so the executive summary, what's the business case? How are you going to do this? Project objectives, I think obvious enough what those should be, or what that represents. Project scope, we've already talked about that. The business case, okay, and then you start getting into some more things. So some quick and dirty description of the executive summary, the project objectives, the scope, and the business case. Project organization, how are you going to run this thing? Okay, who's going to work on the project? What are their roles? What are their responsibilities? Who's going to be there to help support the team, but isn't a team member? So it helps to have something like that roles and responsibilities matrix that I talked about. Schedules and resources, right? We need to be able to set a schedule. This is where something like a work breakdown structure on a Gantt chart could be very useful. But obviously we need to know what resources are available to us to help do these things. Because if you don't have the necessary resources available, you're almost dooming yourself to failure. Communication plan. I think this one should be obvious enough. So obviously there's internal communication among team members. And you should have a very specific plan as to how to communicate among team members, how often, by what venues. Is it email? Is it text messages? What is it? But also you usually have external communication between the team and other entities, and you should have that laid out as part of your communication plan as well. Project control procedures, we won't talk about in here. Project assumptions, what are they? And then conflict resolution is one that I always add in. So why do I add in conflict resolution? Because it's almost inevitable that there will be conflict inside a team, especially if a project is highly important, if you have time pressures, things of that nature. And probably all of you have participated in teams where somebody hasn't done their job. May even have been you. And somebody else has to pick up the slack. And hard feelings result. And then the conflict starts. And then you're not able to make the progress you need to make. So what the point of conflict resolution piece in the team charter is about is to say, when we have conflict, this is how we will resolve it. So maybe it's person A has not done what they're supposed to do. They've been late to the last 3 meetings. They've been late on delivering some particular result that is needed for you to make progress, whatever it is. Then there's a penalty for them. And maybe that penalty is, I'm sorry, they have to bring pizza for everybody next time. The point in this is to try to get to the place where you take your eyes off the person and you put your eyes back on the project. You resolve your conflict, but you get past the conflict. You don't want to make it about the person, you want to make it about the project. You don't want to make it about the person, you want to make it about specifically about what they've done and how to avoid that in the future. Or maybe there's a learning point for everybody there. To make it impersonal so that you can move forward faster. That's the actual point. And that is about as much as we have to say today about project management. So, hope this helps you, and we will talk another time.